Hey, good afternoon. We're going to wrap up the lecture series for this class today, just sort of quickly going through the events that led up to American entry into World War II. Where we left off last time, we had talked about the various pieces of neutrality legislation that had been passed during the 1930s. And we had wrapped up talking about the United States with the modifications to the cash and carry law in the fall of 1939, essentially entering into a period of what we called U.S. pro-Allied neutrality. So if you're following along in the lecture outline for America and the global crisis, we're in Roman numeral 3. We're going to start in B here, section B, moving along. So again, we're not going to go through every single detail of the 2 years leading up to U.S. entry or every little event taking place in Europe or Asia, but we're going to just hit some of them quickly as we move along here. So, period of the fall of 1939 into the early spring of 1940 is a period that has been referred to in the histories as the Phony War, the period of phony war in Europe. And that was essentially because Germany had invaded Poland, France, Britain, Canada, the British Commonwealth had all declared war on Germany, and then nothing happened. France did not attack Germany. Britain did not attack Germany. No one attacked Germany, and Germany wasn't attacking anyone else. They were just consolidating their gains in Poland, and there was a war, but there was no fighting really taking place. So this was a period referred to, as phony war. The French had completely reversed their way of thinking about how they wanted to fight a war. One might think if the whole German army, or most of it, had, I think 1.5 million men, had gone into Poland, France, which was on the other side of Germany, might then have attacked Germany on its western front. In World War I, everyone had gone into the war with offensive strategies. The French now had a defensive strategy for this second war with Germany. They thought, let Germans come to us. And during the 1920s, the French had built a very expensive and highly sophisticated set of fortifications along its frontier with Germany, known as the Maginot Line, Maginot, named after a French engineering officer, Alfred Maginot, who had sort of designed this series of fortifications. They were massive um, forts and massive siege guns that had interlocking fields of fire. They moved. They were in these gigantic casements, and they could one gun could swivel. They moved about 180 degrees. They could cover each other, so that if one fort were attacked, other guns could then move their other forts could move their gigantic guns to help support that fort if it was under attack. Barbed wire, trenches. Underground, beneath the forts, was an entire system of barracks, arsenals full of all kinds of arms and ammunition, uh, a subway system that could literally take troops from one end of the line to another to help reinforce a fort if more soldiers were needed there. So, a highly sophisticated set of fortifications where the French were essentially just sitting there waiting for the Germans to come, hoping they would attack them, because they thought that any attack against this line would just result in utter failure. But the Germans don't bite. The Germans don't play that game, and they ignore the French and ignore their Maginot Line. In April of 1940, to everyone's surprise, Germany decides to invade the Scandinavian countries. The Soviet Union had attacked Finland, and now Germany attacks Norway and Denmark. Uh, Denmark, of course, bordered Germany. That was a one-day affair. Germany taking over Denmark. That was one wonders why they didn't do it in the First World War. In attacking Norway, the Germans, you would think, well, why attack Norway? Well, it helped to cover a couple of key strategic and logistical bases for Germany. Number one, they were able to capture the very far northern port of Narvik, which was essential to the exportation of metal ore products, mining products that were critical to the German war effort. Great supplies of iron ore and nickel were being produced in these sort of northern mountainous regions of Norway, and Narvik was the chief port for these Norwegian mining products that the Germans really wanted to control. So, number one, the Germans are able to seize these critical war supplies, these mineral ores they need. Number two, um, by controlling Norway, and the Germans actually attacked Norway at 5 different points. When they attacked, there were 5 actual landing areas, Narvik being by far the most northern one. Um, and quite a significant naval battle took place because Britain then sent a naval force to engage the German Navy. And actually, the British Navy was successful in destroying a good bit of the what was then the German surface fleet in naval battles. Excuse me, going on in the fjords around the coasts of Norway. But by controlling Norway now, they now pose a threat to Britain. Okay, across the North Sea now, the British would not necessarily only look at the possibility of a German attack on Britain from their southern or southwestern coast, right? In other words, if you were sitting in London, you would look, I guess, to the well, actually, what would be the southeastern corner of Britain? If you're looking at a map, if you're from London and you're looking south toward the Channel, you'd be looking to the west. But the concern here now for Britain was with the Germans in Norway, they have to consider the possibility of an attack coming from the east across the North Sea up the northeastern coast of the British Islands. So it creates more of a stress on Britain to defend itself. Um, and then, of course, Hitler, knowing he planned to invade the Soviet Union at some point, he's now positioned himself between Britain and the Soviet Union. And Norway, with its fjords, these sort of natural inlets, provided essentially natural submarine bases for Germany to hide commerce raiders and submarines to attack any shipping trying to go on through the Arctic Sea between Russia and Great Britain. So it was a pretty smart move strategically by Germany. The Danes don't fight really. It's a one-day battle. As I said, Norway actually had a small pro-Nazi party um, in their country that was led by a man named Quisling. So Quisling was selected by Germany to rule Norway as their sort of proxy ruler. The Norwegian resistance will fight Germany, and they will fight quite bitterly, and they'll be involved in some pretty extensive sabotage operations with British commandos and stuff moving forward in the future. But they're not able to mount the kind of fight necessary to throw the Germans out of Norway. So Quisling will actually rule the country. And his name will become synonymous with a traitor or a collaborator against one's own country. To be called a Quisling was to be called a collaborator, a Nazi collaborator. So his name sort of went down in infamy after that. During May and June, after these attacks in Scandinavia, Germany would then attack the Low Countries of Holland or the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. And they'll sort of run over these Low Countries, as they're called, very quickly. And next thing you know, here are the Germans parked at France's front door, and they don't wait very long before launching an invasion of France. So by June of 1940, if you were to look at a map of Europe, um, the Germans are in control from the English Channel to the Arctic Circle, and Great Britain's looking pretty well hemmed in. But not to mention that their fascist allies, Italy, are controlling parts of North Africa. So fascism is really sort of spreading out and taking control of the European continent. When the German army does attack France in uh, late May, early June 1940, they attack through the Ardennes forest, which is a very deeply forested area through which um, the French High Command and British Expeditionary Force, who were actually over there trying to assist the French, did not believe that Germany could mount the kind of armored attacks that they had been mounting through such a dense forest. In other words, Germany's new blitzkrieg form of warfare, which involved an armored tank spearhead that would not attack across a broad front, but would look to just puncture your defensive line by concentrating a lot of tanks in one area and just breaking through one part of your line and rapidly moving into the rear. And then it would be followed up by mechanized infantry and then truckloads of soldiers for sort of mopping up operations. But it was a system built on speed and very violent and rapid attacks by armored units, panzer units as they were called, supported by um, aircraft, close air support. Um, the Ardennes forest was such a deeply forested area, no one believed the Germans could get a tank column through there. But to everyone's surprise, they did. And the French had placed territorial guard units there um, on the other side of this forest because they did not believe that's where a main attack could possibly come. So the French had therefore put um, sort of reservist units there, right? These would have been like Army Reserve units or um, National Guard units that were there. So they weren't the sort of first line, front line infantry of the French army that were there, but they got the first line, front line German panzer units coming at them. So it was not a very good matchup there. Um, the French are basically pushed all over their own country. You'll recall during World War One, France had put up a battle with Germany for 4 years and never allowed them to take control of their country. The French army and government lasted about a month before Germany took complete control of France, to the shock of the world. France was a very heavily armed country, but no one was prepared yet for the German style of warfare, the new blitzkrieg form of warfare that Germany had introduced. And you can read a little bit more about that in your textbook because we don't have time for drawing up a mock blitzkrieg on a chalkboard here today. Um, so now Germany will begin to turn its attention toward Great Britain, the last sort of power standing against them. And the era from August to October of 1940 is the time that we call the Battle of Britain. Now, the Battle of Britain is interesting because as a battle, it was not fought on the ground. It's the greatest air battle in history. The Battle of Britain was fought by planes. It was the Royal Air Force, the RAF of Great Britain, against the German Luftwaffe or Air Force um, of Nazi Germany. And it was fought over the skies of southern England and the English Channel. Now, why was the Battle of Britain an air battle? Because Britain was an island. Well, then why wasn't it a naval battle? Because times had changed. Okay, so if we were to go back to uh, the time of Napoleon, looking across the English Channel on a clear day, maybe being able to see the white cliffs of Dover, and talking about what he called perfidious Albion, as he referred to Britain. Uh, Napoleon wanted to invade Britain, right? How come Napoleon invaded Russia so far away, but didn't invade Britain so close to him? The answer, the British Navy. You were not going to attack that island because you had to get through its navy. And the British Navy had fairly well destroyed what navy France had at the Battle of Trafalgar. Without a powerful navy, you cannot attack Britain. Germany wanted to attack Britain, but didn't have a big enough navy to do it number one, but that was irrelevant because in 1940 warfare had changed. Germany could have tried to send an invasion fleet across the English Channel or maybe across the North Sea to try to land troops in Britain. However, it would have been sunk and sent to the bottom of the English Channel or the bottom of the North Sea by planes because now air power was so important that you could not just launch in an amphibious invasion, that is, putting soldiers on boats and sending them and landing them somewhere, unless you had air cover. Unless you controlled the skies above an invasion, you couldn't launch one. So Germany, before it could actually invade Great Britain, had to gain what's called air superiority over the proposed invasion zones, right? The proposed landing beaches. They had to get control of the skies over Britain and the English Channel before they could hope to attack. So the British knew this, and the British were outnumbered, okay, because Germany had about 24 or 2,500 planes engaged in this battle. Britain had about half that. And the British Air Force, it's important to note in this battle, were joined by a lot of volunteers from Canada and Britain, Canada and the United States, people who, Canadian Air Force was involved. There were American volunteers who came over to help. But then you had pilots from European nations that had been conquered, but either pilots or soldiers who escaped and got trained as pilots. They wanted to fight back against Germany somehow. Many of them had escaped away to England. So you had Poles, you had Czechs, you had Dutch, you had Danes, you had Norwegians, all of them also flying with the Royal Air Force against Germany. Um, so Germany began with these bombing raids to sort of soften up England for an invasion, trying to destroy their infrastructure. It became a sort of nasty psychological, sort of morale based battle aimed at civilians and inflicting terror on the British population. Because where the battle had initially been a conflict between British fighter pilots going up to attack German bombers that were coming. And of course, the German bombers were being escorted by German fighter planes. So the British are trying to, fight off the fighter planes and down the bombers so they can't do damage, right? Um, that was how the battle was going initially. And the Germans had worn the British down fairly well because when the British lost planes or pilots, they were having trouble replacing them. Okay, and the Germans were sending so many waves of attacks that these British pilots would finish flying a sortie or a mission, land, get a little bit of a rest, a cup of coffee or something, have time for a cigarette. Next, you know, they're being scrambled back up in the air because another attack is coming. So these men, their planes were getting worn out, shot up. Um, they're fatigued, right? They're losing men. So the stress was very great, and it seemed like the Germans had pushed them to the edge, to the breaking point where they could possibly win. Um, the only reason that the British were able to hold their own, by the way, was because of the introduction of radar. The British had set up radar installations along their coasts, and radar allowed them to be able to pinpoint where exactly German attacks were coming, and then British could mass planes to that point. So where Germany had the strength in numbers, Britain was able to sort of allocate its lesser numbers more pointedly to focus on the points of attack. So this helped them sort of even the odds, so to speak. But anyway, so they had hung in there, but now they're just sort of at the brink when Adolf Hitler, as he did a number of times throughout World War II, decided to play general and intervened and ordered his commander Hermann Goering of the German Luftwaffe to begin a terror bombing of the city of London. So September of 1940, about halfway into the battle, the Germans shift their focus from these bombing operations against sort of British infrastructure to attacking the city of London itself with the hope of terrorizing the British civilian population into wanting to surrender. It's a terrible, and this is the phase of the Battle of Britain that's called the Blitz, which in German means lightning. So this is the period known as the Blitz. So some people say, well, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, they're not the same thing. The Blitz is a phase of the Battle of Britain, right? So during the Blitz of London, British people were living in subways. They moved their children to the countryside to live with wealthy families in the countryside so the children couldn't be killed. Like if you've ever seen the film, maybe when you were younger, Chronicles of Narnia, right? That's why those kids are being moved, right? To get away from the Blitz. Um, the civilian population of Great Britain takes a real beating. Something like 40,000 British civilians are killed during this period. Um, it's a very, very dark time for the British people, but they don't give up. London is one of the world's biggest cities, and it just absorbed the bombs. It's a huge city, and a lot of the city was destroyed, but they couldn't destroy all of it. And eventually, the Germans just gave up on blitzing London. During this time when they were focused on this, it allowed the British to build and develop some new aircraft, get deliveries of new aircraft from the United States. Um, it gave pilots time to heal, time to rest up, time to repair planes, time to train up new pilots. And by the time the battle resumed and the Germans went to shift tactics back to what they had been doing, it was too late, and the British had gained the momentum, and the Germans gave up the battle by October of 1940. So this was the first instance where Germany had been stopped in anything, Adolf Hitler, anything he had tried to do since 1938. Really, actually going back to violating the Versailles Treaty back in 1935-36. This is the first time anyone had stopped Adolf Hitler. And this gave a lot of hope to the Allied cause. The British people and the government, of course, the Battle of Britain became a major propaganda point for Britain to appeal to US public opinion. American public opinion became pro Allied, but remained entrenched in neutrality. Okay. So at the time of the Battle of Britain, over 60% of Americans wanted to maintain neutrality, but 60% of them now favored direct aid to Britain and its allies. But people are beginning to understand now that Britain is, you know, so to speak, last man standing. Um, Great Britain's the last thing standing between um, Adolf Hitler and the United States. If he were to gain control of Britain, what would stop him from deciding he was going to attack the United States next? And we were very ill equipped to handle that. I mean, at the time, the United States had a standing army of about 175,000 men prior to the 1940 conscription law, whereas Germany had 5 million men under arms and had not yet invaded the Soviet Union. So the United States was not in a position to uh, be ready for that right away. Um, so Franklin Roosevelt has made it very clear that he is pro-Allied. He's sort of been reinvigorated by this new alarm that's been caused by Nazism, and sort of whereas his New Deal programs were stalled to a certain degree, and there wasn't a lot occurring on that front. After 1939, this whole European war thing sort of reinvigorated Roosevelt and shifted his focus now to matters of foreign affairs, as does much of the United States press as well, right? The Hearst media, William Randolph Hearst and his media outlets, resist this media shift toward the Allies, but nonetheless, more and more of the American population is becoming pro Allied, as is Hollywood. And you can see some great examples in Hollywood films. For example, the 1940 film The Seahawk, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, was a film about the invasion of Britain by the attack against Britain by the Spanish Armada. And if you were to watch Betty Davis's speech in the final scene of is it Olivia de Havilland? No, I'm sorry. I believe it was Betty Davis, not Olivia de Havilland. I misspoke. The fight where the Queen of England gives her speech in the final scene of the film. It talks about this tiny island with the dark clouds gathering around it before they're about to face the Armada, and it's really sort of drawing an allegory toward where Britain stood back in 1688, right? That they're about to be attacked by this massive force swarming around them to try to sway American moviegoers, to sway public opinion. Another great one, favorite of mine from very early 1941, is Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, where Sherlock Holmes is taken out of the 1890s and suddenly he's thrust into the 1940s. He and Dr. Watson uh, battling Nazis in wartime England and trying to help um, break up a gang of Nazi saboteurs and sympathizers who are about to help a German invasion of Great Britain. A great propaganda film. Again, trying to take a favorite American movie character who is British and turn American public opinion in favor of um, Great Britain. I'll actually be using that film in my American 1914 to 45 course in the fall. So Roosevelt, some of these syndicated press columnists are warning, as are some people like Charles Lindbergh and other isolationists, um, are beginning to argue that Roosevelt is trying to get the United States into a war now. We have to be careful. Roosevelt wants to take us into war. Um, So there becomes a real sort of battle between interventionists and isolationists over what the United States should do. As the United States moves into 1941, it's taking an increasingly pro-Allied position. Okay, um, between Germany's attacks on Britain, the operations of the Japanese in China, Mussolini's he had invaded Albania and was beginning to, was fighting against Britain in the deserts of North Africa and Libya. The United States is watching this war that's going on 3 continents, right? So you've got Hitler on the move in Europe, you've got Italy and Britain fighting in North Africa, and then the Japanese and Chinese bogged down in their own war in China. In January of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt delivered, as what is called his Four Freedoms speech, in which he argued that all men were born with four essential freedoms. All freeborn men have, you know, four freedoms. That is freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Okay, and freedom from want meaning poverty, hunger. So this was put out there as a sort of an inspirational speech. It was interpreted by many as being a pro Allied speech because obviously it spoke to a set of values that ran contrary to those of Nazi Germany. One could also say they ran contrary to those of um, the Soviet Union, which was also an aggressor nation at this point, but was not fighting um, Germany. So let's take a second to talk about that. So in August of 1939, although fascism and communism, as I've described it to you in a prior lecture, were polar opposites ideologically speaking in terms of the political spectrum, um, Adolf Hitler had sort of gamed Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, by concluding a treaty with the Soviets in August of 1940, the Molotov von Ribbentrop Pact, which was better known as the Non-Aggression Pact, where Germany and the Soviet Union agreed, despite being mortal enemies politically, not to fight each other. And then this allowed room for Germany in the following month to invade Poland. About a little more than 2 weeks after um, Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the other side, from the east. So Poland got hit from the Germans by the Germans from the west, and then the Soviets from the east. Uh, the Soviet Union also took control of what were called the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and a part of Lithuania, as well as attacking Finland. So while the Soviet Union wasn't attacking nations of Western Europe. It was attacking nations of Northeastern Europe who were minding their own business. So the Soviet Union is not yet an ally of the United States because they're not yet fighting the Germans, but there's certainly another aggressor nation out there where there is no freedom of speech, worship. There is no freedom from fear under Joseph Stalin, that's for sure. He murdered far more of his own people than Adolf Hitler did. And there was no freedom from want or hunger. Actually, um, Stalin had starved to death something on the order of 6 million people in the Ukraine during his famous terror famine back in the early 1930s. So while this was interpreted as a pro-Allied thing by some, it's been said that Roosevelt actually intended this as a New Deal type of thing. So it was a sort of a catch-all speech that sort of spoke to a number of concerns um, for free people in the Western democracies at this time, and the number of democracies in the world as fascism and communism are taking over more and more countries, as well as Japanese militarism has others under assault. Um, the number of actual democracies in the world is shrinking at this point. Um, in a frightening kind of way, right? So you could see that Gandalf had better ride in pretty soon, right? Because the orcs are everywhere. That was you know what that was. So anyway, let's talk about Lend Lease. So one of the creative ways that Franklin Roosevelt comes up with to try to help Great Britain at this time is a new law called Lend Lease. The British, who were preparing for a German invasion, as we talked about a few minutes ago, um, needed ships to try to fight off attacking German naval craft. So they asked the United States for destroyers. That is a type of warcraft. If you ever play Battleship, they're smaller ships. And a destroyer is sort of shorthand for a submarine destroyer. They're surface ships that are usually on the outer perimeter defense of a task force, naval task force, when it's moving. And they're there to just sort of try to detect and chase and kill submarines, as well as, they're faster moving than bigger ships and provide fire support. So the Lend Lease program um, was a program under which the United States lent weapons to Britain um, and also provided the British in return. Um, so, okay, the United States could lend weapons and aid to foreign countries, right, who needed it. They lent the Soviet Union, or excuse me, the Soviet Union, British 50 destroyers, 50 old sort of World War I era destroyers to help fend off an invasion of Britain. And then the British allowed the United States leases to build naval bases and military bases on British possessions in the West Indies and Caribbean islands. So it's sort of that was how the deal worked. The British provided leases on their bases. We lent them destroyers, and moving forward, we were able to provide military aid, but it wasn't direct aid because we said we were lending it to them. So here, we're going to lend you guys all these rifles and just give them back to us when war's over. So it was kind of a silly little mechanism, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that, okay, you're going to give it back to us, which, of course, that wasn't going to happen. During the war, about $50 billion in Lend-Lease aid went out from the United States. So this helped Britain, this helped China. Later on, it helped the Soviet Union, helped the Free French troops, helped a lot of people fighting against fascist aggression. So it was really a form of direct foreign aid, which we weren't supposed to do under our neutrality laws, but because we were lending them stuff, Congress accepted it. Okay. In the spring of 1941, the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany, to everyone's surprise, okay, despite this non-aggression pact that the Soviets had concluded with Adolf Hitler. Joseph Stalin, in one of the great acts of diplomatic opacity in world history, for some reason trusted Adolf Hitler enough to conclude this document and was taken surprise by an attack by the Soviet Union. Excuse me, an attack by Nazi Germany of the Soviet Union. The Germans had moved 300 divisions of their army to the Eastern Front, that is, to the borders of the Soviet Union. You know, the Germans had pushed down into the Balkan regions, they had troops in Poland, troops in Czechoslovakia. The Germans amassed 3 million soldiers to invade the Soviet Union. Certainly, there was intelligence notifying Joseph Stalin that, hey, comrade, you might want to know there's like, 300 divisions of the German army all over here now. Um, comrade, oh, yeah, and what Stalin is thinking, I cannot tell you. I mean, maybe he was just locked in his little theater, drinking vodka and watching Three Stooges movies. I don't know what he was doing, but being that caught by surprise by this German attack is just one of how can someone have 300 divisions on your border and you're not thinking, maybe we should take this seriously, right? Um, so hugest invasion of troops, on a land scale, possibly in history. Um, the German army just sweeps through massive portions of the Soviet Union, traveling just hundreds and hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, in a three-pronged attack, moving south toward the oil fields in southwestern Russia, straight at Moscow, and then up to the north toward the area of what was then called Leningrad, formerly Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, and that area up around the Baltic Sea. So it was a three-pronged attack into what would be northwestern Russia, central Russia, and then southwestern Russia. Um, I'm still staggered that they were confused by this. But anyway, in the first year, about half the Russian army is killed or captured. The Red Army, it would be called. It was no longer Russia, Soviet Union, but German troops just roll over them at first. They were just ill-equipped, good fighters, but just overwhelmed by the blitzkrieg tactics of the German army. And by December of that year, the German troops reached the suburbs of Moscow. That's how far they had penetrated into the Soviet Union. The problem was the Germans were moving so fast they outran their supply lines. And then by the fall, they run into fall rains, and Russia gets very cold. You may have heard this, and the roads turn into mud because it's not a very modernized Western society. There's a lot of rural roads that turn into mud, especially when you've got heavy tanks and trucks churning it up. We're not talking about horses and men dragging cannon anymore. Now we're talking about huge things weighing several tons grinding up in the mud. So the German army is just bogging down in the mud and the cold. They haven't brought supplies for a winter campaign because they thought it would be over so quickly. And they suddenly find themselves stuck in Russia freezing. Again, lessons of history. Napoleon did this one time and it didn't turn out well. Hitler was very confident that he was going to do better than Napoleon. Um, So while all this is going on, so let's back up a little bit before the fall of 1941. In the summer of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill now see the Soviet Union has come into the war. When the United States sees the Soviet Union come into the war against Germany, Roosevelt determines, because remember, Roosevelt had recognized the Soviet Union back in the early 1930s when he was doing FCN treaties and such, that conferred diplomatic recognition. He now wants to extend Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. Now, remember, the United States didn't want to back the Spanish loyalists because they were communists, right? But in this case, with Great Britain under attack, Roosevelt wants to provide weapons to help Russia. And the reason to support them is because it will take heat off of Britain. If they can keep Hitler focused and keep the Russians continuing to fight him, he's not going to take his attention off the Soviet Union and he won't be able to exert the bulk of his force on Britain. So the United States is helping both sides. Roosevelt and Churchill have a secret meeting in August of 1941 off the coast of Canada, what are called the Maritime Provinces of Canada. And Churchill travels across the Atlantic on the HMS Prince of Wales. Roosevelt manages to disappear from Washington. These folks are told he's taking a little break to go yachting, have a little downtime, and the two of them meet and talk about what they're going to need to do to defeat Nazi Germany. And they agree that they're going to prosecute the war until the Nazis are defeated, and that the war will be fought to sort of ensure, and then the peace should be concluded to ensure that the world will be able to stand on the principles essentially that Roosevelt had delivered in his Four Freedoms speech. Excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. So also is where they begin to talk about for the first time, the idea of a United Nations that would be um, organized after the war. So they adopt the Four Freedoms as a set of principles, and the United States now becomes more drawn into the conflict as we see the U.S. beginning to fight an undeclared naval war in the North Atlantic against Germany. Um, Sort of similar to the undeclared naval war, the quasi war with France, which we fought back in 1798. Um, American destroyers are assisting British convoys in traveling back and forth now across the Atlantic. Um, American ships are now going to escort these ships all the way to their ports. Uh, American ships are patrolling for German submarines around Iceland, which has become sort of a real point of conflict in the trip across the Atlantic. So Iceland becomes a real sort of war zone. The waters around there. A number of American um, destroyers are attacked by the Soviet Union, or excuse me, the German submarines there, including the Greer and the Reuben James, USS Reuben James, which was sunk, and something like 115 American sailors went down with the ship. So we're, for all intents and purposes, fighting Germany at this point, uh, well before months before any war has been declared. Okay, let's move across to what's going on in the Pacific, and let's wrap up here about talking about trouble with Japan. So, of course, after Japan attacks the United States, and the United States declares war on Japan within 2 or 3 days, um, both Hitler and Mussolini will declare war on the United States, right? So that will become a formalized thing in December of 1941 with those Axis powers declaring war on the United States. At this point, with the United States getting together with Churchill and supporting him so closely, Germany, Japan, and Italy had all agreed that if any of them were attacked by the United States, the other two powers would declare war. And so eventually, after Pearl Harbor, we'll see that Hitler and Mussolini declare war on the United States for declaring war on Japan. Right? Is how that ultimately works. Um, in 1941, the United States beyond its being troubled about Nazi aggression, was equally concerned about Japanese aggression. Again, as we talked about in this course, back as early as the turn of the 20th century, the United States had been preparing itself for a Pacific naval war against Japan, which had made really no secret about its desire to establish a great Pacific empire. Um, American policy toward Japan begins to really toughen in 1941. Um, with the German conquest of France and Holland, it laid the Pacific colonies of those European powers bear. Okay, so we talked about, remember, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, right? The Japanese wanted the Europeans out of Asia, out of the Pacific. Well, with the Nazis now taking control of um, France and uh, the Netherlands, this meant that those French and Dutch colonies in Asia and the Pacific could no longer look forward to any kind of support from their home countries. They were on their own. They were just dangling out there for the Japanese to pick off. Okay. Um, with the fall of France to Germany uh, in the late spring, early summer of 1940, um, Charles de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle, had named himself the leader of Free French forces around the world who were fighting against Germany and sort of fascism, right? Within the Free French military movement, there were two factions. There was de Gaulle, first of all, who was essentially the president, right, the leader of Free France, which had its own flag, and you'll see de Gaulle actually when you watch the Ike film that we'll have the discussion for him about. You'll see de Gaulle, and you'll see the flag of Free France on his staff cars and stuff, right? So de Gaulle was a very sort of far right conservative Frenchman, and he was in Britain in exile, where both the Free Polish and Free French governments and a number of other free governments of occupied countries were in residence, right? Then there was the FFI resistance. This is, when you hear about the French resistance, these were the communists, essentially French communists in France, who were fighting against German occupation actively in France. So you have these two factions um, within the Free French military. Recall that French Indochina, meaning Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, was a French colony, right? But because Germany had taken control of France and installed a new sort of puppet government, it was a fascist puppet government in France called that they set up in a spa town in southern France called Vichy, Vichy. So the Vichy government of France, which most people of a democratic sentiment saw as an illegitimate fascist government, not the real government of France. Nonetheless, it took control of all French colonies. Okay, so um, French troops in Vietnam were now under Vichy control. That was the government's, right? So when the Japanese decide to move from China into Vietnam, the French welcome them in. Uh, and the Japanese army is now beginning to base itself in the northern part of Vietnam in 1941. It's at this point that the United States really begins taking the Japanese threat in the Far East seriously, because if you were to look at a map and look at lines of latitude, you'll see where the Philippines, which the United States was in control of, lied on a line of latitude to Vietnam, which is directly east, right? So the Japanese massing troops in Vietnam allowed them to either strike southward toward the Dutch East Indies and British Singapore, or to launch an invasion east toward the west coast of the Philippines. So the United States begins taking this Japanese threat much more seriously in the Far East. They freeze Japanese assets in United States banks. We begin sending a series of diplomatic notes to the Japanese, making it clear that the United States would protect its interests in the Far East, meaning Philippines first and foremost, but also Guam and Midway Island, Wake Island, these islands out in the Pacific. Um, and that the United States would demand adherence to the Atlantic Charter with respect to the treatment of peoples in Asia. The Japanese, in their response, predictably, given some of the things we talked about in the previous lecture, called this hypocritical. The Japanese saw this as hypocritical, that the United States did not object to white colonialists from France or Britain or Holland controlling Asian populations, but they're going to make a big deal out of the Japanese doing it. They say that the United States needs to just learn to accept it, that they need to accept the Japanese role in China as predominant. Um, they demand that their assets be unfrozen in US banks. And the Japanese also say that they are going to try to stop any naval expansion in the Pacific. So don't the United States think about trying to expand its naval presence in the Pacific. So they've essentially declared a sphere of influence. And again, sphere, right? Their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Japanese essentially declare their sphere of influence to the United States. Well, the United States, comes back, says, "Hey, we expect Japan to pull all of its troops out of Indochina, Vietnam area, and observe the Atlantic Charter." So this is going back and forth throughout 1941. Um, in the Americans had also imposed embargoes of war materials to Japan. Remember, we were talking about how resource poor Japan was. So the United States had put an embargo on shipments of various types of supplies to Japan, including scrap metal, which the Japanese would sort of melt down and repurpose into, making planes and ships and all kinds of things. Excuse me, but also petroleum. Oil shipments to Japan would be stopped as well. So we're just sort of cutting off their military lifeline if they don't get out of China. We're telling them we want them to not only get out of Indochina, but pull back in China itself. The United States wants the Japanese to start retreating back toward where Japan is what we're telling them. So finally, we get to the last week of November. So there's a lot of just back and forth posturing. Remember now that FCN treaty we talked about that the United States had concluded in 1919 or 1921 is about to expire in December of 1941. So last week of November, the Japanese begin their strike against America. Okay, the Japanese have decided they're going to go to war. And it was clear that America was taking a very firm position on this and would not back off. They couldn't get the oil and scrap metal they needed to continue to fuel their military machine. They, at that point, therefore need the goods of Southeast Asia, and they need particularly the petroleum and oil from the Dutch East Indies. They have to have it. Again, and that's modern day Indonesia, right? And the other thing is they just can't make any moves in the Pacific, Asia, if the Americans decide they're going to assist in that. If the United States decides they're going to come over and get involved, it's suddenly the Japanese are not going to have room to maneuver. So what they need to do is take the United States out. But how do you do that? Because the United States is a much larger, much more powerful nation. So how can the Japanese just take us out, right? How do you eliminate the U.S. presence in the area? And that takes us to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And what is the Japanese logic for this? If you have never seen the film, and I'll just make a little movie suggestion here for you because I know the film last time it used to be on Netflix. There's a very good film about the attack on Pearl. Now, don't say Ben Affleck. Nope, stop yourself. Stop, please. Never go Ben Affleck with me. Okay, never. Okay, don't tell me about Pearl Harbor. Okay. There's an older film. Yes, of course. There's an older film, but it's in color. I know older films that are in color. Okay, so this is from 1970. It's called Tora Tora Tora. Okay, that is all about the background of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Gives you the American side and the Japanese side. It's got an international cast, and you see what's going on in both camps leading up to the battle. Okay, may not have all the special effects of Pearl Harbor, but I think it's a more satisfying story of the lead up and the strategies involved. So you want to check that out. It was made in 1970. I believe Martin Balsam was in it. And I forget um, who the other actors were, but look that up. I believe that's on Netflix, and that's an oldie but a goodie. That's what my dad would call a classic. All right. So let's talk about the Japanese logic behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. Um, the Japanese are thinking, of course, they know the industrial power of the United States is far beyond um, that of Japan. And the Admiral Yamamoto, Isoroku Yamamoto, who's the commander of the Japanese Pacific Fleet, and of course, they don't have an Atlantic Fleet, right? He's the commander of the Japanese Imperial Navy, um, has spent time in the United States, and he's seen the size of the country, he's seen the massive industrial capacity, and he's telling his Japanese colleagues, like, you guys, I appreciate all the bold talk, but you don't know what they got over there, and he's trying to he tries to caution them about you know, attacking the United States, but that's the will of the Japanese military, and he's the guy who has to craft the plan, right? So the Japanese logic, which is Yamamoto's logic, essentially behind this, is if they can get the American Pacific Fleet fairly well neutralized, right? Because they know the United States is getting sucked into this thing with Britain and Germany on the other side of the globe, right? So if they can get the Pacific Fleet fairly well neutralized, then it gives Japan an opportunity to expand and take America's Pacific possessions. So that by neutralizing their Pacific Fleet, they could quickly grab America's Pacific possessions. And next, you know, the United States could be knocked back out of the Pacific as far as Hawaii or possibly even San Francisco if the Japanese are able to. And then America would just quickly sue for peace. They would be hit so quickly by Japan, it would become evident that Japan is a predominant power in the Pacific, and America would just sue for peace with Japan because they wouldn't want a war with Japan on one side, maybe a war with Germany on the other. So Yamamoto conceives a very daring plan on how to do this. They start a big strike force moving across the Pacific 10 days before they actually plan to strike. Well, of course, it would take that long for them to get to the strike point, right? So last week of November, something like the 26th, the Japanese Navy leaves Japan, this gigantic force moving toward Hawaii. All the while, Japanese diplomats, ambassadors in Washington, D.C., are negotiating with American diplomats, like, except they're not negotiating in good faith. They know darn well this invasion force is on its way. They're just playing for time to keep the United States distracted and let the United States think everything is fine and dandy. We're just having some disagreements about things. The Japanese fleet moves under radio silence so that American listeners who would pick up Japanese radio traffic are not picking up any signals, a massive amount of signals going back and forth between ships of a massive strike force. So there would be no prior notice of them coming. And of course, shortwave radio was the major means of communication between the Japanese Foreign Office and Japanese embassies. And these messages were all encrypted in code, of course. So there was the Japanese strike force, the Navy forces moving under radio silence, but there's still diplomatic channels where Japanese have shortwave radio traffic, right? So the Americans are monitoring this also. And the messages are encrypted, okay? And they know that there were particular Japanese um, code words that were out there that if they heard those words, eastward rain, if that came across Japanese radio, they knew an attack was on. No one knew exactly where the attack was going to come, but they knew an attack would be on if they heard that phrase. So United States intelligence is in DC is monitoring Japanese diplomatic radio traffic. They pick it up uh, on the morning of December 7th, very early, they pick up uh, this phrase, and they send warnings to the Philippines and Hawaii, um, sent by cable, right? Um, and nobody picked it up. Nobody picked up the messages. They weren't marked urgent. They sat in an office, and they didn't get delivered until 4 hours after the attack happened. So um, the Japanese get away with this sneak attack. Um, Now, there's been a great, this has been one of the great controversies, sort of conspiracy theories, right? How much did America know? Did we know the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor? Did uh, did we intentionally sit on the information to allow the attack to happen so we could get involved in the war? There have been all kinds of conspiracy theories about this. Um, Anyway, I don't get involved in conspiracy theories. But the result of the battle was that 3 American battleships were sunk, 8 others were crippled. Okay, something like 20 other naval ships were destroyed. We lost almost 200 planes. 2,400 about American servicemen, mostly sailors. Also, civilians were killed. A lot of wounded. So this sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was really the final straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, with the United States and Japan. The Japanese ambassador had an appointment that morning to meet with the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. They were supposed to meet at 11 o'clock Eastern Time for a scheduled appointment. The Americans knew what was happening in Japan, excuse me, in Hawaii. They had gotten news of the attack going on in Japan. And so they kept the Japanese ambassador Nomura waiting for an hour because it was obvious that he was going to deliver a message saying that the Japanese were going to attack. And the Japanese, because this was 11 o'clock Eastern time, if you did the time difference with Hawaii, and I don't know if that's 5 or 6 hours, they made sure they kept the guy waiting for an hour before they would meet him, so that way, when he delivered the note, he had to deliver the note after the attack had already happened, so he would quote unquote lose face and be humiliated. This way, he had to deliver the note after the bombing started, not before, right? So, here, I'm giving you 2 minutes notice, we're about to start attacking you. They didn't let the Japanese play that game and forced them to basically suffer the disgrace of the sneak attack that they actually did and what it actually was, right? At the same time, this was a very coordinated Japanese effort throughout the Pacific. So when Pearl Harbor was just not a singular move that day, the Japanese made a number of moves. The Vichy French government which controlled Southeast Asia, was told by the Germans, allow the Japanese into French Indochina, let them move south, let them go get the oil that they need. They also now become concerned for an attack on the Philippines, which is about to happen. So the Japanese just basically make their move throughout Southeast Asia, begin attacking American installations at Wake Island and other points in the Pacific. And so, of course, after Pearl Harbor the next day, Franklin Roosevelt asks Congress for a declaration of war, and the United States enters World War II. And that's where we have to stop. So, thanks for listening, and that's everything you need to know to get up to the final exam. With that lecture that we just had, I would focus on the points having to do with neutrality and American efforts to avoid getting into this war. Okay? All right. Thanks.